My name is Ethan and I was 17 when I met Jake. He was charming, sweet, and everything I thought I wanted in a boyfriend. We met through mutual friends and he seemed perfect at first, always there when I needed him, always saying the right things. His smile lit up any room and his words made me feel special. It was the kind of love I had always dreamed about. At first everything was great. We'd go on dates, share stories about our past and laugh at silly things. But slowly something started to change. Jake's sweetness turned into possessiveness. His calls became more frequent, and his texts more demanding. I brushed it off, thinking it was just because he cared so much about me. But over time I started noticing cracks in his behavior. He would get mad when I hung out with friends or spent time with family. His jealousy was masked as caring, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that something wasn't right. Still, I tried to make it work. I kept telling myself that love was supposed to be complicated at times. That maybe I was overthinking things. One night I found a text on his phone that shattered everything. I had never snooped before, but something in me, something gut-wrenching, compelled me to check his messages. I didn't know what I was expecting, but certainly not what I found. The message was from Lily, his stepsister. "I miss you. Can't wait to see you tonight." And there, in the attached photo, was Jake and Lily laughing together, so comfortable that it made me sick to my stomach. I felt like the ground had shifted beneath me. My hands shook as I stared at the phone. I had always known something was off, but this was proof that everything I thought I knew about Jake was a lie. I confronted him the next day, my heart pounding, my voice shaky with the shock and hurt. "Jake, are you seeing someone else?" He denied everything, of course. He lied through his teeth, saying it was just a friendly message. He said it was no big deal, just something harmless that I shouldn't worry about. He promised me it was nothing. He was just being close with her because they were family. But I knew better. His excuses felt hollow, and deep down I could feel the betrayal taking root in my chest. That's when I started to realize who Jake really was. He wasn't the sweet, caring guy I thought I had fallen in love with. He was a manipulator. A liar. And his games were only just beginning. Days passed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The conversations we had after that confrontation felt forced. Jake acted as though nothing had happened, but I could see the cracks in his facade. He would be distant one moment and overly affectionate the next, as if trying to convince me everything was fine. But it wasn't fine. And deep down I knew that. I had tried to ignore it, to push it to the back of my mind, but the truth wouldn't stay hidden. It gnawed at me, kept me awake at night. The unease turned into paranoia, and I found myself questioning everything Jake had ever said to me. The texts I had seen, that wasn't a slip-up. That wasn't just a harmless message. It was proof of something much deeper. One evening when Jake was out with his friends, I decided to do something I never thought I would. I went through his things. His computer. His phone. I know it sounds invasive, and maybe it was. But I didn't know what else to do. I was desperate for answers. It wasn't just the text with Lily. It wasn't just the little things he had said in the past. What I found shattered me completely. Weeks of messages, explicit photos, and conversations that made my stomach churn. Jake had been seeing someone else for months. Not just anyone, his stepsister. His step-sibling. The same person he had been so defensive about when I asked him about her. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I wanted to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. Instead, I sat there, frozen in place, staring at the screen. It felt like my whole world was crumbling. Jake had lied to me. He had manipulated me. And worse, he had used me. The worst part? I knew he was still seeing her. I could feel it. Every time he came home late, every time he seemed more distracted, I knew in my heart it was because of her. I confronted him once again, this time with the proof in my hands. "Jake, I know. I know what's been going on. You can't lie your way out of this anymore." He stood there, silent for a moment before finally admitting it. "It's not what you think, Ethan. I didn't mean for it to happen. It's complicated, okay?" "Complicated?" I echoed, my voice rising with anger. "You've been lying to me for months. You've been with her behind my back, Jake. How could you do this to me?" Jake didn't seem as sorry as I thought he would be. Instead, he stood there with a smug look on his face. "It's not that big of a deal, Ethan. You were never really mine to begin with. You knew I wasn't the type to settle down." His words cut deep. They were a cruel reminder of everything I had overlooked. Jake had never really cared about me, not the way I had cared about him. I had been nothing more than an option to him, someone to use, someone to manipulate. But that was the moment I knew something had to change. I couldn't keep allowing myself to be his victim. I couldn't keep giving him the power to hurt me. And so, I made a decision. The truth hit me harder than I had expected. I wasn't just heartbroken. I was furious. The anger I had been suppressing for so long finally boiled over. For months, Jake had used me, manipulated me, and cheated on me with no regard for my feelings. He had treated me like a fool. But now, I wasn't going to let him get away with it. I couldn't just walk away quietly. I wasn't the type to keep quiet about something like this. The feeling of betrayal was suffocating, but as the days passed, something inside me shifted. I wasn't going to let him continue living his life as if nothing happened. I wasn't alone in this, though. There was someone else who had been hurt by Jake's actions. David. David was a guy from Jake's past, someone Jake had also manipulated and used, and I knew he had been suffering in silence for a while. David had always been around in the background, but like me, he had been pulled into Jake's toxic web. I reached out to him one night, feeling both nervous and determined. David answered the phone after a few rings. "Hey Ethan. What's up?" "David," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We need to talk." The line was silent for a moment, and I could hear David shift in his chair. "About what? What's going on?" "I know about Jake and Lily," I said, the words coming out more harshly than I intended. "I know what he's been doing to both of us. And I want revenge. I don't want to let him get away with this." David didn't answer immediately. But when he finally spoke, his voice was firm, filled with the same kind of hurt that I had been feeling. "I've been thinking about this for a while, Ethan. I've had enough of him and his games. Let's make him pay." That was all I needed to hear. David was on board. The plan to destroy Jake began to form, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of control again. I wasn't the victim anymore. Now I was the one calling the shots. That was all I needed to hear. David was on board. The plan to destroy Jake began to form, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of control again. I wasn't the victim anymore. Now I was the one calling the shots. David and I talked about the best way to approach this. We had to be smart about it. We needed to catch Jake in the act, expose him in the worst way possible. We needed to show the world who he really was. But we also had to be careful. He had to believe we were still in his corner, that we were still loyal to him. It took a lot of careful planning, but eventually, we came up with a plan that would make sure Jake would never be the same again. We decided to trick him into thinking David and I were going to live together. Jake would think he had won, that he had manipulated both of us into doing what he wanted. But in reality, David had secretly planned to move in with me, not with Jake. We would make sure Jake thought he had control, only to pull the rug out from under him at the last minute. And once we were living together, it was time to expose him. We had everything we needed: his texts with Lily, his lies, and all the screenshots that would prove what a manipulative, abusive person he really was. Jake would no longer be able to hide. The world would know the truth. We set our plan into motion slowly, making sure we moved with precision. Jake had always been an excellent manipulator, so we had to be careful. If he even suspected that something was off, it could all fall apart. David and I knew that the only way this would work was if we played him at his own game. We started by making sure Jake believed he was still in control. David and I acted like we were still friends, pretending everything was fine. We would joke about living together and how cool it would be, while secretly, we were preparing everything behind the scenes. The more comfortable we made Jake feel, the more we could control the situation when the time came. Jake, as expected, didn't question anything. His ego was too big. He saw David and me as pawns in his game, people who would bend to his will without hesitation. He couldn't have been more wrong. We had to be strategic. David started pulling away from Jake slowly, distancing himself just enough to make it seem like everything was normal but leaving room for Jake to feel like he still had influence over him. Meanwhile, I began the process of moving my things into a place David and I had arranged together. We found an apartment, a place where Jake would never think to look. It was perfect, hidden away enough to keep the charade intact, but far enough that Jake wouldn't find us until it was too late. The days leading up to the big move felt like an eternity. I couldn't stop thinking about how satisfying it would be to see Jake's reaction when he realized what had happened. The rage I had once felt turned into a steady sense of calm. This was it. This was our chance to make sure he couldn't hurt anyone else. Finally the day came. David moved into the new apartment first, while I pretended like nothing had changed. Jake, completely oblivious, believed that David and I were still going along with his plan. He had no idea that the tables had already begun to turn. I kept up appearances, pretending like I was still in Jake's corner. I stayed out late with him, kept things casual, and allowed him to think I was still buying into his lies. Meanwhile, David was busy at the apartment, setting everything up, arranging furniture, making it feel like home, all while keeping a close eye on Jake's every move. Jake, smug and arrogant as always, started to feel more comfortable. He let his guard down, which was exactly what we wanted. David and I had done our homework. We knew the right moment to strike. That moment came on a quiet Saturday afternoon. Jake had invited me over, convinced that I would help him with some relationship problems with Lily, his latest excuse for his behavior. When I arrived, I knew it was time to make my move. He had been careless, thinking he could still manipulate me. "I think it's time you know what's really been going on," I said, my voice steady and calm, betraying none of the emotions that were running through me. Jake's face froze. He tried to play it off like he wasn't worried, but I could see it in his eyes. He had no idea what was coming. I told him step by step how we had set everything up, how we had played him. And as I spoke, David walked in from the back, revealing himself. Jake's expression shifted from confusion to panic. "You thought you could control us," David said, his voice dripping with disdain. "But we're done with being your pawns." Jake tried to stand, to act like he had the upper hand. But it was too late. The truth was out. Everything he had done, every lie, every manipulation, it was exposed. David and I didn't waste time. We had already taken the necessary steps to ensure Jake's world would come crashing down. The evidence was everywhere. Screenshots, texts, conversations that proved how much he had betrayed not just me, but everyone who had ever trusted him. The silence in the room was suffocating. Jake, desperate and cornered, tried to talk his way out of it. But his words fell flat. He had no excuses left. There was nothing he could say that would erase the truth. Jake's world unraveled quickly after that. The secrets we exposed about him, the lies, the manipulation, the infidelity, were like a bomb going off in the quiet life he had built. For years, Jake had played the part of the charming, perfect guy. But now, in front of everyone, he was nothing but a fraud. His carefully constructed image crumbled, and I watched as it all fell apart in front of him. David and I made sure that Jake's secrets weren't just kept between us. We made sure that everyone who mattered in his life knew the truth, his friends, his family, the people he had worked with. We sent screenshots, proof, and links to everything. Every dirty little secret Jake had ever kept was laid bare for the world to see. The first blow came when Jake's family kicked him out. His mother, who had always supported him no matter what, couldn't look at him the same way anymore. His father, disappointed and disgusted, told him to leave. His step-sibling Lily, whom he had betrayed and used, couldn't even bring herself to speak to him. Jake didn't know what to do. For the first time in his life, he wasn't in control. He had lost everything in the blink of an eye. And while he sat there, trying to justify his actions, the truth was that there was no excuse for what he had done. It wasn't just his family. Jake's friends started distancing themselves from him. People who once admired him now turned their backs. They couldn't trust someone who had deceived so many people, someone who had used everyone around him for his own benefit. His reputation, once spotless, was now tarnished beyond repair. But that wasn't enough for us. David and I had one more step to take. We wanted to make sure that Jake couldn't escape the consequences of his actions. We wanted to make sure he would never be able to manipulate anyone again. David had contacts who could help with that. He reached out to people who knew how to dig deeper, to find the skeletons that Jake had hidden in his closet. It didn't take long to uncover even more lies and betrayal, financial fraud, abuse of his exes, and more. We knew the right people to talk to, the right way to expose him in every possible corner of his life. And when we were done, we made sure that those in power, the authorities, the people who could hold Jake accountable, knew exactly who he was. As the weeks passed, the repercussions of Jake's actions grew. He was ostracized from his social circles. His reputation became a joke, a cautionary tale of manipulation and deceit. And then came the final blow. Jake was arrested. It was for a string of charges that had been hidden beneath the surface. The financial scams he had been running with friends, the way he had manipulated his exes into staying quiet about the abuse. All of it came to light. It wasn't just about cheating on me or lying, it was about the life he had built on lies, manipulation, and deceit. When he was taken away in handcuffs, I felt a strange sense of relief. I had no sympathy for him. After everything he had done, after everything I had suffered, I knew that this was the justice he deserved. The person who had torn my world apart, who had broken me and others, was finally being held accountable. But as much as it felt like a victory, I knew it wasn't over. Jake might have lost everything, but so had I. My heart had been broken, my trust shattered, and the scars from his abuse would take time to heal. I wasn't sure if I'd ever be the same person again, but I knew that I was done being a victim. The dust had settled, but the aftermath of Jake's destruction lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. The arrest, the public humiliation, Everything had happened so fast, but it felt like it had taken forever to get to this point. I had watched as Jake lost everything, and though there was a part of me that felt justified, there was also a part of me that knew the damage couldn't be undone. I had gotten my revenge, yes. But in the process I had also lost a part of myself. Jake's family had disowned him, and his friends had scattered like cockroaches, all of them too afraid to be associated with him anymore. He had no one left. No one to blame but himself. It was a bitter pill for him to swallow, but it was one he had earned. For me, the journey wasn't as simple as watching him fall. While David and I had gotten our revenge, there was still the matter of moving forward. I had to rebuild my life. I couldn't stay trapped in the pain Jake had caused, no matter how satisfying it had been to see him unravel. I had to find a way to live again. David and I stayed in touch, our bond strengthened by everything we had been through together. What started as a plan for revenge had turned into a solid friendship. He had been through his own battles with Jake, and together, we had come to understand what it meant to heal, to let go of the anger that could consume you. But for me, the hardest part was the emotional weight I was carrying. Jake had manipulated me, used me, and then discarded me when I no longer fit into his plans. It wasn't just the betrayal of the cheating, but the emotional abuse that came with it, the constant gaslighting, the blaming, the manipulation. That kind of damage doesn't just go away overnight. It lingers. It takes time to heal. I spent months working through everything in therapy. I couldn't move forward until I understood how much I had allowed Jake to control me, how I had let myself be blinded by his charm and his lies. It wasn't just about him anymore, it was about me. I had to learn how to trust myself again. And eventually I did. Slowly. Bit by bit. I started hanging out with my friends again, reconnecting with the people who had been there for me before Jake ever entered my life. I began to heal not just from the betrayal, but from the emotional scars that Jake had left behind. It wasn't easy, but it was possible. As for Jake, he disappeared from my life entirely. After his arrest, he spent time in jail, but I didn't follow his story anymore. It wasn't my concern anymore. He had been exposed, his secrets laid bare, and I had no reason to look back. I had what I needed, the peace of knowing that justice had been served. The months that followed were quieter, but they were also better. I learned that revenge, while satisfying in the moment, doesn't solve everything. It doesn't erase the pain, and it doesn't bring back what was lost. But it did give me closure, and sometimes that's all you need to begin rebuilding. As for David, we remained close, always checking in on each other. We both knew the road to recovery would take time, but with each other's support, it seemed a little less daunting. Jake's downfall had been a long time coming, and though I had played a part in it, I knew the real victory was in moving on. In reclaiming my life, my peace, and my sense of self. As the weeks turned into months, I found myself slowly putting the pieces of my life back together. I was no longer the person I had been when Jake entered my life. I wasn't the naive teenager who thought love was supposed to be easy, who believed that a few words of affection could make up for manipulative behavior. I had learned the hard way that love wasn't about what someone said, it was about how they treated you, how they made you feel. David and I continued to talk, and our friendship, which had been born out of revenge, evolved into something much deeper. It was through our conversations that I began to understand how much I had changed, not just because of what Jake had done, but because of the decisions I had made since. I wasn't the same person I had been when I met him. I had grown, learned, and most importantly, I had started to value myself again. For the first time in years, I felt like I was living for me, not for anyone else, not for approval, not for validation. It was a strange feeling, almost like I had been walking around with blinders on, and now they had been removed. I was seeing the world through a different lens. The first major step in my recovery came when I decided to focus on my own happiness. I had spent so much time being consumed by Jake's betrayal, by my anger, that I had forgotten what it felt like to just be at peace with myself. So, I did something I hadn't done in years. I took a trip. I went to the beach alone just to clear my head, to reconnect with who I was before all of the chaos. The trip was a revelation. I spent days walking along the shoreline, reflecting on everything that had happened. For the first time, I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't holding on to the past or wishing for revenge. I was just living. I was just being. It was in that stillness, on that beach, that I truly understood the power of letting go. Revenge, no matter how satisfying, had only brought me temporary relief. But this peace, this sense of freedom, was the real victory. When I returned home, I felt like I was starting fresh. I had a renewed sense of purpose. I began spending more time doing things that made me happy, whether it was pursuing new hobbies, reconnecting with old friends, or simply enjoying the quiet moments I had once taken for granted. I learned that happiness didn't come from exposing someone else's flaws, It came from accepting your own, and from embracing the power to move on. I also began to heal the parts of me that had been broken. It wasn't easy and I still had moments of doubt, but I was no longer willing to let the past control me. I worked through my therapy, learning to trust again, learning to understand what love was supposed to feel like, not the toxic, manipulative kind I had experienced with Jake, but a love that was grounded in respect and honesty. It wasn't a perfect process. There were days when the pain of the past resurfaced, when I thought about everything I had lost. But those days became fewer and farther between. And with each passing day, I felt more in control of my own life. As for Jake, I didn't think about him much anymore. He had faded into the background of my mind. His manipulation, his lies, they didn't have a hold on me anymore. I had moved on and that was something I couldn't take back. It wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about freedom. And in that freedom I found something I hadn't known I was missing, myself. The more I worked on myself, the more I began to realize how much trust had been eroded during my relationship with Jake. It wasn't just about him lying or cheating, it was the way he made me question my instincts, made me feel unworthy and unsure of my own judgment. That's the part that stung the most, the realization that I had allowed someone to make me feel so small, so insignificant. I had to rebuild that trust and it wasn't going to be easy. David played a huge role in this process. He had been through similar experiences with Jake, and together, we could speak openly about the damage caused by his manipulation. David helped me see that it wasn't just Jake's fault. I had played a part in allowing the abuse and lies to continue. I had ignored the warning signs hoping they would go away. But David also showed me that I wasn't alone in this journey. We were both learning how to trust again, not just other people but ourselves. The first real test of my trust came when I started dating again. After months of reflection and healing, I felt ready to try again, but the idea of opening my heart to someone new terrified me. Could I really trust someone else, knowing the damage someone like Jake had done? But there was a guy named Chris who had been there for me throughout everything. He was a mutual friend of mine and David's, someone I'd known for years, but had never really thought about in a romantic way until now. Chris was patient, kind, and had never shown any signs of manipulation or deceit. We started spending more time together, just hanging out at first. No pressure. No expectations. Just two people who enjoyed each other's company. And slowly I began to see what real affection and respect looked like. Chris didn't demand my time. He didn't manipulate me into doing things. He was genuine, and for the first time since Jake I felt safe. But even then there were moments of hesitation. I would find myself wondering if Chris was secretly hiding something, or if he had an agenda. It was hard to trust, but I kept reminding myself that I had to be open. I had to give him a chance. I couldn't let Jake's legacy of doubt haunt me forever. I took small steps, little by little, letting my guard down until one day I realized that Chris had earned my trust. It wasn't fast, but it was real. And that, for me, was a victory. The process of rebuilding trust didn't just apply to romantic relationships. It extended to my friends, my family, and, most importantly, to myself. I had to trust that I was strong enough to make better decisions in the future. I had to trust that I was worthy of love, respect, and honesty. And every time I took a step forward, every time I made a choice that was rooted in self-respect, I felt like I was healing more. The wounds from my past weren't as fresh anymore. They were still there, but they didn't control me. I controlled how much they affected me. David and I continued to support each other through this journey of healing. It wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. We had both been through hell, but we had come out stronger, more aware of what we deserved and capable of recognizing the signs of toxicity before they took hold again. Jake had tried to break us. But in the end, his actions only made us more resilient. We had learned the hard way that trust wasn't something that could be taken lightly. But when it was earned, it was the most precious thing we had. And I had learned to trust again, not just others but myself. Months had passed since Jake's fall from grace, and I found myself standing at a crossroads, unsure of what the future held but determined to step into it. The past was no longer a shadow over my every move. I had faced the consequences of my actions and of the pain Jake had caused, but now it was time to focus on the future. Chris and I had continued to grow closer, but this time there was no rush, no pressure. We weren't trying to fill the void that Jake had left. We weren't looking for a quick fix to the hurt we had both endured. We were just two people taking it slow, learning to trust one another. The relationship felt different, healthier, more grounded, and for the first time in a long while I felt hopeful. David and I had our ups and downs, but we were both moving forward. Our bond had strengthened in ways I hadn't imagined possible. We had both taken back our power from the wreckage that Jake had caused, and together, we had found peace in knowing that we had done the right thing. We had taken revenge, yes, but the most important part of the whole ordeal was that we had reclaimed control over our lives. We were no longer the victims. We were survivors. I started to think about the things I had put on hold, the dreams I had pushed aside in favor of Jake's manipulation and control. I had spent so much of my time trying to please him, trying to make our relationship work, that I had forgotten what it meant to live for myself. But now, I was rediscovering those passions, those ambitions, and I was ready to chase them. I enrolled in a few evening classes, something I had always wanted to do but never had the time for. I started exploring new hobbies, photography, cooking, even hiking, and I realized that the world didn't have to revolve around someone else's toxic behavior. I didn't need to depend on anyone's approval. I could create my own happiness. David suggested that we take a trip together. A real getaway, not just to run from our past, but to embrace the future with open arms. It wasn't a trip to get revenge or to deal with unfinished business. It was a trip to reconnect with ourselves and each other, to enjoy the freedom we had gained from breaking away from Jake's control. We went on a road trip, heading out of town to places neither of us had seen before. The air felt different in those new surroundings, lighter, freer, unburdened by memories of Jake and his toxic influence. We laughed, we talked about everything we had been through, and we made new memories that had nothing to do with the pain of our past. I returned from that trip a different person. I felt like I was finally living, truly living, not just surviving. The weight of everything I had carried for so long had been lifted. I knew there would still be days when the past would try to creep back into my thoughts, but I had learned how to face it. I had learned how to own my story, to accept the mistakes I had made, and to forgive myself for the parts one couldn't change. Chris and I continued to see each other, but there was no rush. The connection between us grew stronger every day, not because we were trying to fill a void, but because we genuinely enjoyed each other's company. We didn't have to rush into anything. We could take it slow and see where life took us. David, too, was in a better place. He had found a new sense of peace and purpose, one that wasn't defined by his relationship with Jake. He started his own project, something that brought him joy and fulfillment. We kept in touch, and it was clear that we had both learned how to move forward without the weight of our past dragging us down. Jake's name came up occasionally in conversations with friends or family, but it no longer carried the power it once had. He was a part of our past, a chapter that had closed, and I was finally at a point where I could look back and say, that was then. This is now. And in this new chapter, I was writing my own story. A few months passed, and I began to realize that the final step in my journey was not just about rebuilding, but about letting go. I had spent so much time focusing on revenge, on getting justice, that I had neglected the most important part of healing: releasing the grip of the past entirely. It wasn't enough to just survive the chaos Jake had created. I needed to thrive beyond it. Letting go was never going to be easy. In fact, it felt like the hardest thing I had ever done. For so long, Jake's actions, his lies, and his manipulation had consumed my thoughts. I was haunted by the betrayal, the way I had allowed myself to fall into his control. But I knew that I couldn't continue to let that hold me down. The revenge, the exposure, those had given me closure, but they weren't enough to heal the emotional scars I carried. For that, I had to truly let go of everything that Jake had represented in my life. One evening, while sitting on the balcony of my new apartment, I had an epiphany. I had been holding on to the past for so long, thinking that if I didn't, Jake would somehow still have power over me. But that wasn't the truth. Holding on to the anger, the resentment, it was only hurting me. It was time to forgive, not for Jake but for me. I had carried this weight long enough. I took a deep breath, staring out at the city lights. It's over, I whispered to myself. It's all over now. It wasn't a magical moment where everything immediately felt better, but it was the beginning of true healing. I stopped thinking about Jake constantly. His face, his voice, the way he had manipulated me, it began to fade into the background. I didn't need to carry that bitterness with me anymore. David had been right there with me through this entire process, and even though we had taken separate paths in our lives, we both knew that the only way to truly move forward was to let go of the anger. I had my own life to live now, and so did he. We had been victims of someone else's toxicity, but we were no longer victims. We were survivors. And the power we had gained from that survival was something Jake could never take away from us. The more I let go, the lighter I felt. I started new projects, poured myself into work that brought me joy, and spent more time with people who valued me for who I was, not for who they wanted me to be. I even started to reconnect with family members who had supported me throughout this whole ordeal. The more I embraced this new version of myself, the more I realized how far I had come. And then there was Chris. Our relationship had continued to grow, slowly but surely. We were both in a good place now, He had never pressured me and I had never rushed him. We were just two people enjoying each other's company, knowing that love wasn't about filling a void or making up for the past, it was about sharing something real. We weren't perfect but we were happy. And that was enough. As for Jake, I never heard from him again. After his arrest, he faded into obscurity, his name tarnished beyond repair. It wasn't my concern anymore. I had gotten my justice and with that I had finally moved on. I wasn't going to waste any more of my energy thinking about him. The road to this point hadn't been easy. There were days when I doubted myself, days when I wondered if I was doing the right thing. But now, as I stood at the edge of a new chapter, I realized something. The best revenge wasn't in watching Jake fall. The best revenge was in the life I had rebuilt for myself. The strength I had gained. The person I had become. Jake could have taken everything from me, my trust, my heart, my sense of self. But he hadn't. I had survived and I had thrived. And that, in the end, was the ultimate victory.